Welcome to The Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor. I'm a mediator, developmental psychologist, and married mother of 5. I also teach conflict resolution classes. And like you, I've dealt with a lot of conflict in my own life. And I used to think I could make it all go away if I improved conditions or changed myself. But I've realized that conflict is just part of life. We all need more effective tools to handle it with confidence. So that's what this podcast is about. Each episode, you'll hear me coach a real person through a real conflict in their life. As you listen, you'll notice that I'm not telling them what to do. I'm giving them a set of skills that can apply to any conflict, including the ones in your life. So let's get started. Today I'm coaching Rachel. She recently made a huge change in her career path, and it's not going well. She's having a lot of trouble with her new manager, and it's interfering with her mental health. So we're going to explore her options. Rachel, hi there. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Good. Well, maybe let's just, what kind of conflict has brought you to this conversation?
Oh gosh, it's a work conflict, but it's also most likely a relationship conflict. And the basic gist of it is I left a job in law enforcement back in about a year ago and came back to work for a friend. So I moved from LA to Utah and I'm working as a content writer on a team. And it's terrible.
It's terrible. Tell me more. Why is it terrible?
It's been such a rough year for me in general. As soon as I quit my law enforcement job, I immediately regretted it. In part because as I was trying to make the decision, I was going through a lot of different things. One being, I think I was really depressed for the first time in my life and hadn't known how to deal with that. Law enforcement is a challenge and an adjustment, and another law enforcement young person like myself had committed suicide with their service weapon, and a lot of dark thoughts had started coming from that. I was physically injured at the time and just struggling, feeling at work like I wasn't getting it. I wasn't excelling, and even though I was still new, I think I was putting a lot of pressure on myself and was looking at other options of what I could do, and reached out to my old manager for a letter of recommendation to potentially just like throw kind of lifelines out there and see like, oh, maybe I should do an MBA. And so that's what I was reaching out to her for. And she started talking to me and was like, you should come back and work for me again, because I had worked for her before I left for this law enforcement job. But my gut was like, it's not the right time to leave LA and this job yet. And my gut was kind of specific. It was like March. March would be a good time to leave. And so I was really wrestling with the decision to leave this friend, and who would become my manager was sort of, I guess the story I tell now is that she was really pressing me, because she said, as I waffled, she was like, it's now or never. I ended up going against my gut and said, fine, I'll quit in January and I'll leave. And then after that, everything was a disaster. The job that I am currently in turned out to be not what I was told or not what I expected. And as soon as I got there, I sensed there was no urgency to arrive at the time that I did, and I felt a little betrayed. Then I found out back in LA, like all these problems that had faced me before, like were solved basically, and they were solved within a time window that, my own gut had told me, like, if you should wait. And so it was kind of a gut punch to realize that I was in a situation that I didn't want to be in, and I should have stayed, but blah, 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 all that.
So listener, I just want to summarize for you this next part of Rachel's story. As we're about to discover, the work conflict she's having isn't actually the problem we're going to zero in on today. You'll find out why in a minute. But just so you have the basics, Rachel's really unhappy with the way her boss is managing the team. There are some problems on the team that have gone unresolved, and Rachel's boss has failed to follow through on a number of commitments she's made. And in one particularly upsetting incident, Rachel shared some personal details about her mental health with her boss, who then went and shared that with team members.
I think the ultimate conflict is just a real lack of trust, but also no effort to rebuild trust on my manager's part, which I don't quite know what to do from here.
Yeah, it sounds like it's, again, like you're saying, there's multiple layers to this conflict, right? There's lots of different things we could talk about, but is the internal conflict, is that not as kind of pressing as the conflict with her in particular? Because I'm sensing from you that there's a little bit of, like, you're frustrated with yourself as well for getting yourself in this situation. Is that true, or not so much?
I think more than I'm, upset with my manager, I'm upset with myself that, like, self-betrayal is, I think, way more hurtful than betrayal with someone else. So it's hard to, like, look back on that decision knowing that, sure, I didn't have, like, all the information or the best of information, but I had what my gut was telling me, which later proved to be true. And I think that, of course, like, hurts the most.
Of those two, meaning the conflict you're sensing with your manager or the conflict inside, which would you like to talk about?
I mean, the root of the problem is most definitely the conflict with myself. But in some ways it seems harder to solve than the manager, but I also accept that might not be true.
Are you willing to give it a go?
Yeah.
Okay, friends, most of us have a lot of different conflicts, large and small. They're happening in our lives, usually all at once. And often several of them may be connected by an underlying conflict where if you get at that conflict and you figure it out, the others will ease or resolve themselves. So I encourage you to take kind of an inventory of the conflicts you're facing and see if you can identify a primary conflict that may be worth more of your time and effort. Now, Rachel senses that the internal conflict she's having is probably at the root of what's going wrong at her new job. And I want to highlight a second concept here before we head back to the coaching session. She's articulated self-betrayal as a deep source of pain. She went against her gut or what the deepest part of herself wanted, and she resents herself for that. We each have core needs and wants that reflect our values, personalities, dreams, and goals. And when we dismiss our core needs and wants, we will naturally struggle. There are many reasons why we don't go with our gut. We may feel pressure from others to make up our minds, or perhaps we don't like the feeling of being uncertain, so we choose a known path, even if it's not really what we want. We may be experiencing depression and/or loneliness, which makes it even more difficult to trust our gut. So like Rachel, we may try to go faster through conflict rather than taking the necessary time to assess our needs and create a plan. So the first step in big decisions like career changes or moves really is to acknowledge your gut reaction, which is your deep internal reaction. And then you give yourself enough time to reflect and come to a thoughtful decision about what you want. You can ask yourself, what's my initial reaction? Why am I feeling or thinking this way? What should I pay attention to here? Okay, let's get back to Rachel. So you're now in a situation, a job you don't like, it sounds like. Tell me just a recap again. Former you, if we can just call it former you, former Rachel, when Rachel was making that decision, what did she make her decision based upon? Like, what were you using as your criteria to make a decision about your career?
I think I was at the time considering a couple different factors. I felt a little stuck on my team in the law enforcement job. Some legal issues with the work we were doing felt like there wasn't going to be a resolution. And so I felt like, is this going to be what the next couple years are in this job? And it's not that it wasn't fun or enjoyable, but it just felt stagnant. And I also was not learning as quickly as I thought I was. And obviously it's a complicated job. It takes years to get good at it. And so I think that was obviously short-sighted and naive. And I can see that now. And I think I could see that then too. But I also kept thinking like, oh, I have a background in like English and writing and teaching, and I'm not really using any of those skills. And maybe I should go back to a field where I can, and maybe that would be a better fit. And honestly, that was the story I kept telling people. And it was a pretty decent story, so that no one really tried to convince me otherwise. Only like one or two people did. One person told me outright, like, you will regret this.
Interesting.
If you leave.
I like that you said, I had the narrative I told people, and that people, only a couple people second guessed you. Again,
Yeah.
there's the insight part of like looking back, right? It's easy to look back and see, the story you told yourself and why you told it. If you look back at, former Rachel, what are the points of compassion that you have for yourself, or looking back at her? Like, what would you say? Like, oh, I really get that. I can see why that would have been really tough.
Um, Gosh, that's hard because I think what I was really hiding with that great narrative was that I really needed help, but I was too proud and too scared to ask for it because obviously law enforcement is kind of a tough guy job. And even though I really loved the people on my team and felt supported by them, I think because I was new, I was like, oh, I don't want to be that new person that's kind of a burden because they're struggling. And I saw other people who I knew were struggling because we talked about it in private as friends, and they would show up to work and have, the professional face on. And there would be days when, I would be just like crying for no reason in my car on the way to work. So I feel bad for former Rachel because I don't think she knew what she needed, and I think she was afraid to ask.
Yeah. So listeners, it's easy to be hard on ourselves in hindsight. But my mom used to say, people are doing the best they can. We're all trying to do the best we can in tough circumstances. If you got regrets that are making it harder for you to resolve some of the other conflicts in your life, maybe ask yourself, what are the tough things I've experienced that deserve kindness rather than harsh self-judgment? Self-compassion allows us to see our growth and be more considerate with ourselves in the moment. That frees us up to spend our energy to make the kind of life we want right now. Let's get back to Rachel. So Rachel, you're right now, how long has it been since you left LA in that job?
A year almost.
Okay, so when you look back, what have you learned from the difficulties of this past year? Like, what are the things you've learned about yourself that you're like, I wish I had known that, or now I know this? Like, are there specific things that you're like, I definitely drew this from that experience?
I think I'm realizing I really ran away, and I wish I would have stayed and asked for help and listened to my gut most of all. I think that's the most painful lesson, is that you know that I had that impression, and it was very clear. It even gave me a timeline, which was surprising and generous of my gut, and I still didn't listen. And I worked really hard to get that job in LA, like really hard. And I'm sad that I didn't give myself more time or give myself more credit even. I wish that I had given myself the grace to like grow into it more, and to be patient.
So listeners, for this last little bit with Rachel, we're going to work on a skill called reframing. Often in conflict, we look backwards and ruminate on what we or someone else could have done differently. We spend incredible mental energy and relive the pain and heartache rather than asking ourselves what we've learned from the conflict. We are never going to be able to erase the conflicts, but we can learn from them by reframing our mistakes. So instead of saying, I was really impatient and I made an impulsive decision, we can flip it into something like, next time I have a big career decision, I want to take my time and be thoughtful about it. So let's see how that feels for Rachel. Can you think of any things drawn from that experience last year that you would say in a positive sense as I go forward? What are you going to do that's not like former Rachel?
I think one helpful change that would probably serve me well is being honest. First with myself, obviously.
Okay.
And I think if I start with being honest with myself, I could probably solve a lot of the problems that I feel like I'm facing. And then if I can't, then I'm like, okay, now's a good time to turn to someone else who may have solved this themselves at one point or has good resources or something. But
Okay.
I see that I wasn't honest with myself fully, because I was ashamed of how I was feeling and didn't know how to proceed. So that's one aspect.
That's a fantastic base. And if you were honest with yourself, what would that look like? Say I'm just like observing you. I'm not like, creepy looking, into your life. But if I was observing you being honest with yourself, what would be the concrete evidences of that? What would you be doing that would signal to me or to yourself that you're being honest with yourself?
One thing that comes to mind is one of my closest friends in LA left for almost, a little more than a month, and she was off at a training. But when she came back, I realized that while she had been gone was kind of like the depths of me making this, terrible decision. And so when she did come back and we, went hiking one day, I had already made up my mind and was at that point just sharing with her my decision. And I remember in that conversation kind of feeling a lot of regret, thinking like, oh gosh, if I had just talked to her, I might not have made this decision. I realized that I just didn't include people who knew me well, and even my own sister, I didn't really consult her. And what's funny is that, like, kind of after I'd moved back to Utah and was really miserable, and she was like, you told me to never let you move back to Utah. You made sure that I understood that you're like, don't let me move back to Utah. And I was like, why didn't you tell me that? Like, and again, she was like, you didn't share, what you were feeling or doing. So I made the decision very much in isolation, so that when I had constructed the right narrative to then tell people my decision, it was a narrative that wasn't really open to like pushback to a degree.
I think what you got at is exactly that reframing. Like, I don't think we're ever going to avoid all mistakes, right? Even the fact that we're having this conversation, the idea isn't that, oh, if I had only done this, everything would have, because it's easy to keep ruminating over and over on that, especially if the result is not what you wanted. That's why I was, again, I'm trying to gently suggest that perhaps to have compassion on former Rachel who was depressed. And now, because you hadn't experienced that before, now if you or somebody else is depressed, there's some things that need to be done to scaffold that person, right? At least in developmental psychology, we call it scaffolding. So when you're making a hard decision, you put in place not one thing, if I have one person to talk to that I trust, but it's, I journal write, I ask people who know me well enough, like my sister, hey, call me out on my stuff, whatever that thing is. So to take what you've experienced that's been so hard and then say, moving forward, these are the things that I know about myself. And I just wonder, so I don't know what you're going to do with, the job situation, but next time you're in a decision-making process, and maybe if you're even feeling depressed about it, what would you do to put in place based on those like critical experiences that you've just had learning about yourself?
Yeah. I think I have a very decent amount of people who would be willing to, play devil's advocate or be opposition to my current thought process if I gave them that role. And actually, I can think of one time where that happened, and I was trying to get funding to go do a master's abroad. A friend's father, who was very experienced, very professional in his ability to like go ask people for money and like grant funding or whatever, and I gave him my reasoning, and he was like, no, I don't think you deserve the money. He basically said that's not a good enough reason, and I got I didn't get upset, but I got really kind of like, wait a minute, no, I actually have really good reasons, and I kind of argued back and like gave three more much more solid reasons, and he was like, great, those are excellent reasons to ask for the amount of money that you are seeking, and like that is what you should do with your narrative. And I was really grateful because I think he knew what he was doing too. Like I think he was purposely pushing me as a good kind of mentor and coach would do. And I was surprised like how much I thrived under that type of pressure, and was like, oh, if only I had some other way to kind of initiate that. Like, how can I put some sort of system, either people or things in place that would allow me a similar process in challenging decisions, so that I had, that friction in order to really know what I wanted, or knew my reasoning well enough to fight for it.
Is there anything that you're thinking, now that we've talked about this specifically, going forward, this is what I want to do?
I think what you said about, asking for help, for some reason I've, especially in this work situation, I've kind of conflated that with like knowing what I want. And I wonder if those really need to be like so paired, in the sense that does asking for help have to come with me knowing what I want? And right now I feel like it does need to be paired, but I wonder if instead I just asked for help and let someone else, present, here's how I can help. And then I could go from there. Because right now I feel this really heavy burden of like, I can't ask for help until I know what I want to do. And that seems impossible. So that's why I think I've not asked for help. So maybe separating or understanding what that looks like, or not expecting myself to have answers in the process of asking for help might be useful.
I think that's very important what you just said. I think you have the self-knowledge. Couple that with the compassion for self and what you've learned, but turning it to something like, going forward, this is what I do, as opposed to, I've ruined my life, right? It's really easy to review and ruminate, but there's way more ahead of you than behind.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I appreciate it.
I'm really grateful to Rachel for being willing to wrestle with that big internal conflict. And there are some great skills we can take away. First, we need to pay attention to our gut reactions. That doesn't mean you just go with your gut reaction in every instance, but it does mean that your gut may alert you to some core needs or goals that you need to pay attention to. Second, we can be more compassionate with ourselves. This will allow us to look back on the past with understanding rather than self-criticism. We put our energy into constructing the right conditions for our lives now, rather than endlessly putting ourselves down. And finally, reframing. When we reframe, we take something negative that we've done or said and we flip it into what we want for the future. So in Rachel's case, she regrets making that big career decision without talking to friends and family members that she trusts. So the reframe should be, next time I have an important life decision to make, I'm going to consult with, and then she might name a few specific people. We focus our energy on creating the kind of life we want now and in the future. Thanks for joining me today. If there's someone in your life who might benefit from listening to this episode, please share it. Because as I always say, it's not a question of if, but when we're going to experience conflict. And we do much better when we're prepared. The Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor is a BYU Radio podcast. Find me on Facebook and Instagram at Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily, where I'm sharing more ideas for working through conflict. And if you or someone you know has a conflict that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, send me an email to conflictcoach@byu.edu. And next time, I'll be coaching a woman who's in conflict with her husband's sister. I hope you'll join me.